The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
This episode of the Charlotte Ledger Podcast is presented by Childcare Search. Does your search for childcare have you stressed out? There's a lot to consider, like quality, price, location, schedule, and more. At Childcare Search, a service of Childcare Resources, Inc., our knowledgeable navigators can help you find licensed care that fits your family's needs. Visit www.findchildcarenc.org or call 1-888-600-1685 for free personalized guidance. Hey, it's Tony Messia with the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. You can find out more about the Charlotte Ledger at thecharlotteledger.com. Today's podcast is a recording of an online discussion the Ledger held on April 28, 2026, about college admissions. It's a big and important topic among parents of high school students, and as someone who's had children go through that process, I can tell you it can be stressful and anxiety-producing for both the students and their parents. I talked with Lee Schulman-Beerer of Beerer College Consulting and Ashley Osman of The Essay Architect about a lot of different topics related to getting students ready to apply for college and how to do it. They said it's a process that can start early as middle school, for choosing courses that will affect the courses that students take in high school. We talked about how to write admissions essays and the topics to pick, what colleges are looking for these days, hidden gem schools in the Carolinas, and strategies on how to navigate through all of that and get to the other side where your student is happily in college. It's a great conversation. I hope it's helpful to those facing this moment in the coming months and years. Now, my youngest is a sophomore in college, so I don't have to deal with this anymore, but I feel for those of you who do, and I hope you get something out of the discussion. Feel free to share it with others. This discussion is also available on the Charlotte Ledger's YouTube channel. If you go and you Google College Admissions Charlotte Ledger, you should be able to find it there as well. Enjoy. Now, obviously, this is a very big topic. Whole books have been written. We could talk for hours on this, but what I'd like to do today is talk for a little bit just about the process, sort of the frame of mind that parents and their students should be in, and then some tips on sort of what that process is like, what the parents and students can expect, and just sort of ways to navigate it and get through it, maybe with some form of sanity, because I know this is a time where you can oftentimes butt heads with your teen. There's a lot of stress, there's a lot of anxiety on it, and so we're trying to and I know there are whole networks of information out there among parents, but we're trying to inject something that's helpful and reflect what this process is like. Try to dispel some myths that are out there. So maybe Lee, we could maybe start with you. I mean, what do you see over your time working with parents and students? What have you seen about what this process is like? Why is it so stressful, and should it be as stressful as it is?
It is more stressful. We wish it wasn't, but it certainly is. Colleges are a business, and they're in. What they need to do is to fill their classes. And so they are really actively seeking more applications, because one of the ways that they are ranked is by the number of students that they reject. Okay. So all schools are actively trying to get as many kids to apply. And what that then does is it shoots up the rejection rate and lowers the admission rate. And that's in part, and there are lots of other factors, but that's a big part of what causes the frenzy for families and the stress. And, but I would say, if these are mostly Charlotte families, that the acceptance rate at Chapel Hill for in-state students is over 50%, typically, somewhere between 45 and 55%, depending on the year. But if you're an out-of-state student, it's basically what we refer to as a public Ivy. And so the out-of-state acceptance rate is less than 15%. So that's part of what, one of the myths is that it's absolutely impossible to get into. It is difficult. They need to accept students from every one of the 100 counties in North Carolina. And so it does make it difficult. But there are lots of other schools. We happen to have a great public school system within North Carolina. And we got the beaches, we got the mountains, we've got the woods, we've got crunchy granola in Asheville. There's all sorts of great schools.
So, a lot of parents approach this. They bring their own frame of reference from when they were in college. What has changed over the last few decades about this whole process? You mentioned there are a lot more applications, but what about the process? What is it that colleges are looking for, and what are some things parents might not expect?
So there were always test scores, SAT and ACT, and there have traditionally been, for most schools, essays that need to be written. The differences now are that colleges are looking for well, let me put it this way. Way back, colleges were looking for, quote, the well-rounded student. Okay, the cheerleader and the person in the play, and you were supposed to dabble and do lots of different things. And what's happened is that colleges are really now looking for what we refer to as spike talents, or really more of specialists. They'd rather have students who had dedicated most of their extra time to speech and debate, or to Model UN, or to whatever it is, as opposed to spreading themselves so broadly. So it's depth, not breadth, that colleges are looking for. When you think about it, it actually makes sense. They're trying to replenish all of their roles on campus. The best indicator for a college as to who's going to participate and be involved in the college campus is, what have you done in high school? So it is definitely hugely different, because there are now kids doing research in high school, medical research, and they're volunteering at hospitals, and they're doing all sorts of things, so that it has upped the sort of pressure to figure out, what are you doing for your summers? It's not that it's not good to be a lifeguard. It's a great thing. But you have to understand that at the level of the most selective schools, they are looking for more involvement, more commitment, more what we refer to as fit to major, which means what you're doing in your spare time relates to what you want to major in college.
So what are the implications of that for parents? Because a lot of times, parents are sort of tuned in that this is a process, and that the students need to present themselves in the way that's appealing to colleges. But when they're in 8th and 9th and 10th grade, the students don't always understand that. So how do you approach those conversations? And if you're a parent, what can you do to give your child the best opportunity?
Well, I think understanding that this is all important for 8th graders or early in 9th grade, that they should go to that activities fair at their school. They should join a variety of clubs. They should sort of figure out, I think it's fine if they participate in 3 or 4 clubs freshman year, and then hone in on what's of greatest interest later on in the process, later on in 10th, 11th, and 12th, and look for leadership roles. Again, the best indicator of a leader is going to be your past performance. So trying to find opportunities for leadership, if that's what the student is all about. And lots of kids aren't. They're not natural leaders, certainly not 9th grade or even 10th grade. But using their summers effectively, strategically. And that doesn't mean they have to go away to an academic program for 6 or 8 weeks on a college campus. But it does mean I talk to students about creating sort of a patchwork quilt of different experiences over their summers. So it would be nice to do some community service, certainly have a vacation with the family, try and do something academic, have a job, be an entrepreneur, create a power washing company in your neighborhood or something like that. So the idea of diversifying your interests and really trying to use your time effectively to really sort of make the most of it.
Okay. And again, we are taking viewers' questions. If you have a question, please feel free to drop it into the Q&A. Ashley, just sort of segueing from what Lee was saying, you've been involved in this field for a while, and you're with the Essay Architect. You literally help students tell their stories, but that doesn't necessarily start when they start writing. How do you what's the best way to develop that good story to tell?
It's a great question. I think that there is not a parent that's listening today who would want to trade places with their child right now, given the landscape, given the pressure. And when I think about what the role of the essay is, it's to give dimension and understanding beyond those bullet points of your application. They're going to have your grades, your scores, they're going to have your class rigor, they're going to have an activities list, and all of that is going to tell a story. Okay, but is it going to tell the entire story? Absolutely not. And so what I usually am helping students to do is to identify, first of all, where are the places you're going to have a chance to tell these stories that matter in admissions? What are the stories that are going to reveal your value as an applicant beyond the black and white data points, right? So you, of course, have the big Common App essay, which is the 650-word personal statement that's going to go to all your schools. I think of that piece of writing as doing the most heavy lifting, all right? Speaking to identity, speaking to character, speaking to your value systems. Beyond that, there's then school-specific supplementary essay questions. So, for example, if you have NC State, Appalachian, and Carolina on your list, that one big Common App essay, that 650-word personal statement, will go to all those schools. But then when you look at Carolina, they're going to have two questions where they ask you about what do you want to study? And then they're going to ask you about how you've contributed to a community that matters to you. NC State's going to ask you, what is your first choice major and why do you want to study it at NC State? Appalachian's going to ask you, why do you want to come to App? So there's a lot of stories to tell. What I'm always pushing students to do is to think about that this is a secret weapon in the application. By the time you're applying in the fall, the grades are in, the scores are done. And this is that one piece that you can control. And so what I think about makes something really effective, okay, is authenticity, is leaning in unapologetically to who you are. The story that, and when it comes back to the story that a student needs to tell, one of my biggest questions for students when they come in with a draft, or if we're even in the brainstorming phase, and they come in and they might say, okay, I want to write an essay about golf. Like golf is what I've been involved in. And my question is always, so what? And I don't mean that like glibly. I mean it as in, what is the consequence of this story on your character, on your identity, so that when that stranger in admission gets to the end of your essay, what do they know about you? And so students, I think there's, I wanted today to really give parents actionable guidance on how they can help their students with telling these stories. And topic choice is the big nightmare, right? Everyone thinks, what do I write about? How do I pick that topic? And students feel that pressure that they have to tell the story that has never been told before. And so they spend all this time in a place of paralysis, and they reject lots of topics because they think that's been done. Or, oh, I heard they love stories about trauma. Oh, I heard I can't write about sports. Oh, I heard I have to have a passion project, etc. And most of the time, the stories are sitting right there in a student's backyard. And so what I'm recommending when it comes to telling those stories is really synthesizing and reflecting on How do these stories connect to what matters to you so that you go beyond just telling me about golf? You don't just tell me, I love golf. This is what I spend my time on. I think about a student I had who wrote about this and came in with a draft like that. And the more I probed and tried to get to the heart of this student's story, I remember asking him, I was like, well, tell me about what it's like when you go play. You know, what do you love about the sport? A lot of people hate golf. A lot of people think golf is a snooze, that it's boring. And this student at first had a really hard time articulating the whys. But with a little nudging and a little bit of digging, he was able to kind of pull that thread to get to the genesis of the why. So all of a sudden, he was telling me about how he loves to play alone because his life is so full and busy, and he's got pressure from school, pressure from parents, pressure with his girlfriend, pressure to be on with his friends at school. And when he's on the course, everything would quiet. He would talk about this sense of control that he got to feel right before he hit his shot, where he got to really think and be premeditated compared to like other sports that he played that were more kinetic, that had a different energy. He loved being outside, and like that nurtured his spirit. He had a grandpa who had taught him how to play, and he had this mantra that he told him every time he got his grip just right and lined up his putt. And all of a sudden, when a student approached the story that way, the essay is not even about golf any longer. It's about that student. And if I could give one piece of advice to parents, it would be to help your kids uncover the why behind the stories that they're gravitating towards.
Yeah, I mean, 16 and 17-year-olds aren't always the most introspective, and they probably need someone in their life to talk through it with them a little bit. What do we know about the relative importance of the essay versus other pieces of the application, like test scores, grades, the classes you're taking, that sort of thing?
Well, and I can speak to this, and I think Lee will probably agree. This is the way I've always thought about the role of the essay. And I love this line that I saw from a director of admissions at UVA like 20 years ago who said, you know, a great essay can heal the sick, but it can't raise the dead. And I think about this. In this climate today, you have to have the grades and the scores and the class rigor. That's always going to be the most important. To make yourself part of a conversation at a school, you have to have that. Once you've cleared that hurdle, then admissions is going to be looking at the rest. They're going to be looking for that fit that Lee talked about. They're going to be looking at their institutional priorities. And that is when the essay is going to come into play. But Lee, I'd love to hear your thoughts on your take.
Sure. I mean, I think I always talk to families about breaking the process down to the subjective characteristics and the objective characteristics. So the objective are the transcript, the test scores, obviously the grades. And I refer to that as sort of door number one. You've got to get through door number one to even knock at door number two. Okay. So door number one, you got to have the stuff, right? So somebody's in the bottom half of their class, they're not applying to the Ivy League. Okay. You know, most kids are self-selecting the schools that are generally right for them. But the stats nationally are that 85 to 90% of kids applying to every school, from the least selective to the most selective, get through door number one, which means that if you're talking about Stanford or whatever, all those kids have fabulous test scores and fabulous grades. So the decisions absolutely made on the subjective characteristics, which the most important piece of the subjective characteristics is the essay. Okay. In addition to that, it's the activity list, and it is the supplemental essays in many cases. It's what are you doing over your summers? It's character, it's personality, it's values. It's all of those sort of, you know, fudgy kinds of things that families that you don't really know how to describe, but all of that is really what's going to make the difference. If you looked at two students and they had the identical GPAs and test scores, but one wrote a really personal essay about a struggle they'd been through or challenges and et cetera, that's going to be much more compelling for the school than the student who wrote about, you know, and I'm sure Ashley could do a great job with somebody who wants to write the Friday Night Lights essay, that winning the big game.
The game-winning touchdown.
Yeah, it's been done. That has been done. I'm sure Ashley can make it even better, but the idea is to really focus on the subjective characteristics, and that's something that you can do in 9th grade, in 10th grade, and build that over time.
I'd like to talk a little bit, just kind of go step by step, because, if you're a senior and you're right at the door and you're about to apply, that looks very different than if you're in 7th or 8th grade. So I'd like to start out, and maybe we could just sort of walk through some of these different stages. And I welcome you both to share your perspectives. But for someone who has a child who's in 8th grade or earlier, and there was a question, so what do I do if my child's in elementary school? What sort of things should I be thinking about? What's the thought process there? Are there any things you should be doing or thinking about? Is that too early? Are we putting too much pressure on our kids by having these conversations early? But what should parents be doing, and what should the kids be doing?
Yeah. To me, it's not too early to think about course selection. Curriculum at your school, you can only take the courses offered at your school or through dual enrollment. So dual enrollment is where you're going to a community college, and many, many schools are big fans of that because it allows their kids to take more advanced classes and they don't have to pay teachers at their school. Colleges have sort of mixed reviews about dual enrollment. So if the class is offered at your school, I recommend taking it at the school as opposed to through dual enrollment. But mostly, you need to understand the pathway for different kinds of subjects. So if you are interested in engineering, you really need to be taking calculus. So if you need to be taking calculus, you need to back up and go, what math classes do I need to take in order for me to get to calculus, right? So you don't want to get to senior year and realize, oops, I should have been taking more math all the way along. So course selection to me is the single biggest thing that families can do early on. And then I also think, thinking about how to utilize their summers. And again, I don't mean 12 weeks, 9 to 5 every day, but I think being deliberate about the kinds of choices families make over their summer plans.
I agree with Lee. I think it's really like the course selection stuff is something that I encountered even with my son, that by the time his focus had started to narrow, he was not one of those spiky kids in the 9th grade. But I would say this for my 12th grader and my 11th grader. Were starting really broad. They didn't really know, my son in particular, my senior, didn't have a clear sense of his college path until junior year. And it was a little tricky when it was like, okay, he's on this math path. And if we'd have known this, things might have been different. I think as parents, it's really hard to find the sweet spot on the pressure, right? That we want the best for our kids. We might have kids who are high achievers. We might have kids who have different gifts. And then to speak to the parents who are out there with elementary school, I have a 3rd grader who at this point, after all the college tours she's had to go on, she's like ready to go into the trades. She'll probably renounce college entirely. But it's really hard to walk that line because, like, on one hand, you want your kid to be in the best possible position. What I was hoping for with my own son as we surveyed the landscape and the future ahead, when he was right here at the end of junior year, getting ready to see the summer coming up, knowing that applications were coming, knowing that he was going to have to fill out everything, is hoping that there was not going to be a ton of regret, hoping that as he went into this, that there had been a balance of time for sports, time for friends, time for play, time for breathing. And yet there's also kids who are functioning at such a high level where their version of that is, I need to make sure this is the summer I get a patent. And so it's a little bit everywhere in between. I think it's to meet your kid where they are, in the sense that I wouldn't, at least for my own kids, what I've always tried to do is to give them as many opportunities to follow their passions and their pursuits. And then, of course, like the nudging of like, hey, making sure that you're taking control of your grades, making sure that you're advocating for yourself in a classroom. And yet at the same time, I do think there can be intentional ways, just like Lee said, about understanding what are the metrics you're going to be evaluated on, which means like going to the activities fair, really taking chances. I tell students all the time, if I could go back with any of the students I work with when they were ninth graders, I would say, read books, read anything that lights you up. It's going to make you a smarter human, and it's going to make you a better writer. Stretch out of your comfort zone and try new things. Travel, meet new people, find communities that matter to you. And it's not that I think kids should be living life and curating experiences for the sole reason of getting into college. It's more so that by doing those things, I think will add and create a richer life experience.
That sounds like good advice. So I'd like to kind of keep going through this progression. We talked, maybe 7th, 8th grade, make sure you're in that math class that if so you're in a good pathway to get into the right math classes, the appropriate math classes in high school. Yeah.
That students and families need to understand there are every college has recommendations for what they want students to have, and they have requirements. So a big one tends to be foreign languages. And the more selective the schools, very typically, the more stringent their requirements are, or their requirements are, let's say, 3 years of a foreign language, but their recommendation is 4 years of a foreign language. Well, a lot of kids, you only need 2 years to graduate from a foreign language, to graduate from public high school. So the idea of going 4 years, but that's only if you're looking at schools that require it. The guidebooks and all of their websites tell families exactly what the recommendations are and the requirements. But those are, if they're looking at 2 students equally and one has met their recommendations and the other hasn't, that's a tipping factor.
Okay. And I do want to get to folks' questions. I know we have questions coming in. If you have them, put them in the Q&A. And then what about 9th or 10th grade? If you have a 9th or a 10th grader, by now you're in high school, you're in some of these classes, what should the frame of mind be there?
Study and have fun. Like literally try and create a work-life balance so that by the time they get to junior and senior year, they're whole, they're happy, they're thriving, right? So I think families need to understand their kids. Some kids are more motivated than their parents were, and other kids are less motivated. And I think you need to, just as Ashley said, meet them where they are in terms of their motivation. Share the facts. Share, this is what it takes to get into XYZ school. Does that work for you? And if it doesn't, accept that, because they should be the driver. This is all about empowering the kids to make the right decisions for themselves, but they need the right intel. They need the background information.
We'll be right back to the conversation. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast is presented by Child Care Search, helping families navigate childcare with confidence. One quick tactical question from Julie. She wants to know, where do you find these guidebooks that you mentioned, Lee?
Sure. I mean, Princeton Review is my go-to, but Fisk Guide is a great book as well. They're in libraries. You can buy them online. If you're looking at the more selective schools, Princeton Review comes out every year in August, and it's called The Best of. And this year, I think they're at $399 or 400 colleges nationally, and they've got a 2-page spread for every college. Fabulous information.
All right, let's just quickly fast forward. Okay, 11th, 12th grade. By now, maybe you should be visiting some colleges. You should become a little bit more familiar. Not just, it sounds like the parents need to start tuning in a few years ahead, looking at these requirements and helping guide their child on the class and coursework. But what about 11th, 12th grade? What are some of the considerations there?
Well, I can definitely say that what happens once you hit senior year, it feels like a freight train. There's so much happening once senior year starts. You've got the demands of senior year. You've got all the events that are going to be your last prom, your last homecoming game. All these things, the pressures of your classes, the sport that you're playing. Then you add on college admissions. Then you add on, applying for scholarships. I think to then tack on, having to tour colleges and all of that. I think if you're saving things for senior year, it's a recipe for so much stress. The students that I see when I'm working with students one-on-one in like June or July, they're tanned, they're relaxed, they're chilled out. The kids I see in September are in a bad, dark place because there's so much going on. And I think that there's a sweet spot. I don't think that that means that you have to, hit the tours with your ninth grader. But what I would say as a parent who's just gone through this is that really using junior year, I think is really a perfect time because, as we all know from when we were kids and we've watched it with our own children, ninth and 10th grade, even though it starts to matter then, it's really hard. College feels so far away. And so they may not be dialed in, but by junior year, they're knocking on the door. And so at least from my perspective, I've found using junior year is a great place to start, narrowing, identifying those schools that are exciting for you, the programs that you're interested in. And then my recommendation from a writing perspective is to use the summer. You can use the summer and have your Common App essay complete. You can have your supplementals complete. And you can have your Common App wrapped up before day one of senior year. So that then when you get to senior year and there's all these kind of surprises, like maybe you get invited to apply for an honors college and there's a couple more essays that get thrown in your lap. Or you have the demands of school, or maybe you want to go out for scholarships, that when that extra baggage shows up in September and October, you're not straining under the pressure. Use this summer. For those of you with juniors going into senior year, the summer, in my opinion, is the time to get it done.
Yeah, we're getting a couple of questions just about, you talked about the feeling of pressure about students' mental health and preserving that in this process. And Bridget just has a comment, says, here's what I've learned. If you have a super smart kid and you're willing to pay $90,000 a year, go get a patent, get your kid published, make them a superstar. If you're not able or willing to pay $90,000 a year, look at state schools or the less selective tier where you can get a lot of merit aid. These schools have 40 to 50% acceptance rates and are great places. Why stress your kid out when you can save money and keep everyone sane? College is not worth your kid's mental health. And then we have a question sort of along those same lines from Amanda, wants to know, how can we help students find a balance to support emotional well-being in the college admissions process? It is so incredibly stressful, and way too many kids seem to be defining their worth on the prestige of where they get in or don't.
Dude, Amanda's got it figured out 100% that this feels like a referendum on your value as a human being. That's what it feels like when these decisions come down and you're measuring yourself against everybody in your class. You're measuring yourself against strangers on the internet. And it is really stressful. I remember with my son, knowing his stats, knowing where he hit. He was not a top of the class with patents, and he wasn't at the bottom. He was in a place where I knew most of his schools were going to be a coin flip. My son, like so many others, wanted to go to a big state university and major in business, major in finance. I worked with 20 boys that looked just like my son on paper. And that's the challenge, is thinking, how do we cultivate an experience where he's not going to just get destroyed and face rejection after rejection? As a result, we kind of cast a pretty wide net just for that reason. I'll tell parents, a resource I found really helpful is Jeffrey Salingo's book that came out in the fall called Dream School, which is, he talks about this, that it's the same big universities, the popular universities that have a huge influx. And the big southern state schools are some of those schools. And as a result, you got everybody who wants to go to Carolina and Clemson and South Carolina and Georgia and Auburn and Alabama and Tennessee, and they're all coming. And so what do you do when that feels like the fit for your kid, but the numbers may not be on their side? What I loved about this book, Dream School, is it talked about different ways to find fit, different ways to analyze that there's more than one path to victory. I think Frank Bruni also wrote a book I love, which is called Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be. And I really loved those messages that make you realize that this one decision is not make or break. It is not the end of the world. And at least that was the narrative I tried to use with my kids. As you know, with my son, who just finally has his plans confirmed, and my daughter, who's getting ready to go into this. There's a lot of ways to find success. There's a lot of ways to find happiness, and that ultimately you are more than this decision. And just like Lee said, reminding them that this is a business. I get emotional about this. I get wrapped up in this, I think, like we all do. But Lee's right. You go back to where this is, that schools are going to always do what's best for the schools.
Lee, what about that? Preserving your students' mental well-being, and I would throw in parents as well.
I think for both parents and students, you talking about financial fit is really important. I've worked with students over the years. I can remember the conversation vividly when the parents did not share what their desires were, and the student applied to Duke and University of Virginia and got into all these schools, and they said, well, you're going to Chapel Hill, which is obviously a wonderful choice, but it was not where the student wanted to go. And the student, I ended up writing a column called Bait and Switch, right? It was like the parent said, oh, apply anywhere you want. We'll talk about it later. Well, if this student had known that the parents had basically said, we'll pay in-state tuition, but no more, he probably would have made different choices along the way. And I think it's really important. There is great merit money out there. There are some very, very generous schools, but the person who wrote in, it's absolutely true that privates, Wake and Duke and Hopkins and everybody else are generally somewhere between $80,000 to $95,000 a year. Okay, with tuition being somewhere between 50 and 60, and then the remaining money for room and board and expenses, etc. And I think so that if you are at a school that is costing $85,000 and you get $30,000 in merit, that's fabulous. But that's still $55,000 a year. It's still a very big expense. And so there are three tiers. There's in-state public that are generally going to be somewhere between 20 and 25,000, maybe probably inching towards the $30,000 mark. There's out-of-state publics at Virginia Tech, Georgia, etc. Those are going to be somewhere typically between 30 and 50. And then there are publics that are generally going to be between, Elon happens to be a really great bargain at like 55, but most of the privates are going to be in that $80,000 to $90,000 range. So.
Okay, we got a question sort of piggybacking on that. Any hidden gems in North Carolina, bonus if public, or the Southeast that are good schools for average performing students?
I'd go with UNC Asheville. I mean, I think you are basically getting a private school education for public school pricing. So it is small, fewer than 4,000 students. So you're having that nice environment, a little bit more nurturing. But I remember going on tours there, and my tour guides were from out of state, and it was cheaper for them to go out of state at North Carolina than to go in state at their own state school. So we happen to have really good in-state schools. And other hidden gems, I do think Elon is a great one, good for that B plus student. They are more widely generous, but with less money, if that makes sense. In other words, they give money to lots more students, but it's not typically going to be $30, $40, $50,000 per student. They spread it out differently.
Got it. Ashley, I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say South Carolina, if the test scores are strong, and at Clemson as well, in-state students, North Carolina students can get in-state tuition at those schools. So they can, so that's a big deal.
Okay, Ashley, I've got one that sounds up your alley. How do you handle the story they create through their application if their activities don't line up with their intended field?
This is a great question. I encounter this with students all the time. There are some kids out there who I think are lucky in their own way that they're these heat-seeking missiles of ambition and have known since 8th or 9th grade that they want to go into medicine and that every single thing has been guiding them. And then I think what is really more often the case is, again, more scattershot, trying different things, seeing what sticks, what doesn't. And then as you're moving forward, how do you then present that case to the school? Because the school, like you said, is looking for fit, especially for schools that are going to select on major. They're going to sometimes really want to know, all right, well, if you say that you're going to pursue engineering, like tell me what that looks like. And maybe you want to do engineering, but what if you don't have that calc that's so critical? Maybe you didn't go to, some engineering programs over the summer, but you finally took that class, second semester, junior year, and realized, wait, I found my thing. So I think the power of the story is your secret weapon. That's the ticket, because you're going to have these opportunities to tell these stories that admissions isn't going to know. Those bullet points on the activities only reveal about this much. And so what I think about a student, let's say we have this engineer, this late blooming engineer, is using your essay. And depending on where you're applying, that might mean doing it in the Common App, or it might mean doing it in a supplement, is being really specific. Specificity is absolutely key in the way that you get traction in your stories, no matter what. So you take this engineer, and maybe this engineering student doesn't have tons of content to draw on from all these years, but they had that one class or that one moment. Well, telling a story in detail, talking about the moment where you're building the bridge out of toothpicks and marshmallows, or, being in your bedroom that one summer and building, the Lego Millennium Falcon and not leaving, for meals because you were so obsessed with creating and building something. Students tend, when they get into this, is they're speaking in generalities. And so I'll get a student who will say, oh, I know I really want to study medicine because I'm fascinated by the human body. And the same with the engineers. I really love the way things work. And these are the same narratives for every single student out there. It doesn't mean that they're wrong. What it means is that they lack specificity. So the responses aren't individual. They're going to get lumped in with everybody else. So when I have that kid who comes in and wants to write about having a passion for biology, I'm like, wait, let's tell a story that shows it. And all of a sudden, the student can remember the feeling of the scalpel in their fingers and slicing open the cow eyeball or the hairless cat in anatomy and watching their lab partner pass out at the table. Those are the stories. Shadowing, your parent's friend who's, an anesthesiologist, and how you got to watch a live childbirth or you mopped up blood. The details are your currency in these stories to help your narrative come alive. So that's what I think, is that if you don't have a whole proven track record of passion that originated from the first moment, you can still tell a potent, powerful story that connects to something true and real.
I've gotten a few questions along these lines, and something occurred to me as well, that, a lot of times we as parents are very motivated to make this process happen, but teenagers are not always as motivated, certainly as parents are. And some of them, maybe they don't know what their passion is, or they don't seem passionate about very much. Do you have, Sandra asked, any suggestions for those students who aren't passionate about any specific area or subject?
Well, I find that, first of all, a lot of students feel this pressure that, they have to be some academic weapon, that they have to, be writing about those kind of stories. Those are not hardly ever the stories that come to life right off the bat. There are some kids who have these great, powerful stories, but students, I've never met a student who doesn't light up about something. Now, it may not be calculus and they might not light up about anatomy, but maybe they light up about their favorite band or how they're obsessed with
But
anime.
what if it's video games,
It can be
working out at
video
the
games.
gym and scoring the touchdown on Friday nights?
One of my favorite essays of all time was about a student who loved weightlifting, who found himself in the gym. And I remember his dad had called me and he's like, I really want him to write about his service. And I'm like, he's going to get a chance to write about service and other essays. This kid wrote about having his headphones on, blaring, Seven Nation Army while he's got the squat rack and he's trying to hit 350 and what it felt like and how the gym transformed him from A to B. And it was gorgeous. It was wonderful because that's what I think about when I get to the end of an essay. What I want to know is I want to be able to see that student. I want to be inside their brains and their bodies. I want to be able to hear their voices. And at the end, again, no matter the topic, it can be Coldplay, which I've read. It can be about anything under the sun that by the end, if I know you, and I'm a stranger, if I know you, you've done something right. And to avoid that sensation of that I have to be a different version of myself, that I have to shape shift into this perfect applicant. No. Lean into the freak that you are. I mean that 100%. Because you all have these little stories. You have all these little things that if you lift up the rock and you look, there's something valuable. 100%.
Lee, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I'd like to relate one of the stories. I work with kids all the way through the process. So from the very beginning all the way through the application, the essays, et cetera. And one of my students, we were just chatting. And so the brainstorming time to me is the most valuable, teasing a good essay out of a student. And so she was a stellar student, so in top grades and top scores and all of that. And she did a lot of community service, but nothing was jumping out. And then I said, well, is there anything you do, frequently, that sort of speaks to me? She said, well, no, I walk the dog with my father every night. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, at like 6:30, my dad and I go for a walk. And I said, and she said, we've been doing this since I was in second grade. And she told this amazing story about how she got pulled into a bush and there were some bugs in the bush, and she said, oh, bugs. And Dad said, well, but they're good for nature. And the whole essay was about the evolution of the relationship between the father and the daughter over time, and how now she was almost teaching her father, but she was talking about things that she loved learning in her classes. And it was just, she got personal letters from 4 schools saying this was one of the most beautiful essays that I've ever read. And it was about her walking her dog, right? It was so much more, but I think sometimes we need to simplify the essay brainstorming process and really try to understand the character, personality, and the values of the individuals, right?
Let's talk a little bit about the writing of these essays. We've gotten a couple of questions, and I probably no webinar is complete without talking about AI. Here we are in 2026, but there have been a couple of questions about what do we know about the use of AI in both writing essays and in reading and scoring essays. How is that changing this process, if at all?
The AI has been a challenging piece to deal with this year, for sure. And there are a million kids that AI'd their essays and applied with AI essays, and maybe got in with AI essays. So I had a few students this year that I worked with who, after we would sit and brainstorm and we'd uncover this great story and we'd talk about, make a blueprint and kind of collaborate on structure and detail and tone and specifics and all this stuff. And I had students who brought me back AI work that took me about 3 sentences to clock. And what I did this year is I had a student that did this, and I remember asking her very gently, because it really was meant to be a teaching moment, not like a gotcha moment, because this student wasn't trying to fool me. She told me, she said, well, I wrote mine, and I felt like it wasn't good enough. It felt messy. It didn't feel right, and I put it through chat, and what came out looked better. And we looked at them side by side, and I told her, and she needed me to teach her why her original was better writing and stronger writing, that what she saw from the AI version looked polished, it looked clean. To me, it looked completely fraudulent. It didn't have voice, it didn't have detail, and that when I finished reading it, I couldn't, as a reader, I couldn't see her, I couldn't imagine the scene because there was no scene. But it was slick and boring. And it sounded like other stuff I'd read before. And what the student was so wonderful because she gave me permission to use her both versions in an essay presentation I gave just 2 weeks ago. And I was able to show all these students, look at the difference that when you write with your real voice, that the imperfections and the humanity that come through real writing cannot, at least not yet, I feel like can't be replicated. When I talk to 17-year-olds all day long, and they very rarely use phrases like a deep stab of regret. The wound had reopened. And I'm like,
here's the thing. Here's the thing, colon.
Here's the thing. It's not this, it's that. They are looking, they're begging for you to be real. And I think that, yes, there's going to be kids that do it. I think that there could be no greater a risk you could take as an applicant because, as Lee said, they've got so many people in that stack who already made it through door number 1. Okay, so they read that essay. They have a trained eye, just like me, just like Lee, and they're going to detect it. And do you think they're going to take a chance on you if they doubt your authenticity as an applicant? Or are they going to pick the next person in the stack who's keeping it real? So I 100% implore students, do not outsource your memories and your stories to the robots.
Right. It sounds like, yeah, they want that the individuality to come through. Lee, in the last 5 minutes that we have remaining, I know it is very quick to do this, but I know you have a presentation with some tips and some secret tricks. I don't know if that's quite the right word. Can we maybe go through those rapid fire, lightning round? Those might be helpful. And I know there are a lot of questions people have asked. We haven't gotten to them all.
I had it up. Oh, I do. Okay. So, yes.
You can share your screen,
all right,
maybe.
So let me share 1 sec. Sorry, guys. Okay. And wait a minute. Here it is. Okay. Can you guys see this now? Secret number 1?
No, I can't see it.
Oh, here we go. How about now?
There we go.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Okay, so I already talked about that. Oops, sorry. Okay. So yeah, door number 1 or the objective, door number 2 is the subjective stuff. I'm gonna just race through these because I think there are a lot of good nuggets in here. Don't focus on the rankings. It doesn't matter whether a school is ranked number 6 or whatever. We're talking about fit. We talk about the trifecta of fit. We talk about an academic fit. We talk about a social fit for the student. Is this going to be a place where they walk around and see kids that look like them, that they want to be friends with? And then we definitely want to talk about that financial fit for the family. Okay, so don't focus on the rankings. Pick your courses wisely. I think we touched on this one. Let's see. Whoops, sorry. Fit, again, researching schools. Visit colleges early and often. I wrote a column several years ago because I was at a cocktail party with some friends, and one of the people said, we're going to wait until he gets in and then we'll go visit the schools. And I was like, no, don't do that. You don't need to visit every school. But what I've often said is visit Davidson, visit UNCC, right? One is a big public, one is a small private. See what feels like the kind of campus and environment that you'd like. And then use those spring breaks. Go over the summer. You're going to see more kids in soccer uniforms than students, but if you go over the summer, it's also a good time. Families always ask, is it worth it? Definitely worth it. Okay. There's something called demonstration of interest. The more selective schools don't utilize that, but some of the less selective schools really care if you came on a visit, if you write a letter, if you reach out to a professor. They track all of those things. Did you open your email? Did you respond to something? So show your love.
Yeah, and if you show up at one of those, sign in. Make sure you sign in at the admissions office so they know you were there.
Absolutely. We didn't get into any of the early decision, early action, single choice early action, restricted early action, but there's lots of ways to apply. If you are certain that you want to go to a school and you have discussed the financial implications of getting in and not getting aid, and that works, then applying early decision can boost your the application acceptance rate, in some cases double or triple, depending on the school. So that's a great thing if you know you want to go. Diversity matters. It's not just racial diversity, it's diversity of experiences. And I think that that's really important when you think about extracurriculars. Don't be a serial joiner, be an angular student. I talked about that a little bit earlier. Summers count. We talked about that. Essays, okay? Hopefully nobody needs to deal with this, but if you do, be honest. If something happened, write about it in the additional information essay and explain why it happened. Follow directions, okay? Identify the colleges that may want you more than you want them. That's where you're going to get the money, okay? And don't get so emotionally involved, because my favorite statistic is at Halloween, 95% of kids are at their first choice school. So they may go to a school that they didn't think was their first choice, but kids are more resilient than parents think. On that note, I'll end.
Well, that's a great way to end it. A nice, hopeful note. Ashley, any final quick thoughts, words of advice, things to do or not do? You want to wrap it up?
One last note that I didn't get to touch on as much is the best writing is going to be in your kid's voice. It shouldn't look like an English essay. It shouldn't be there to flex. It shouldn't be there to overreach. It's the place to let them be who they are. That would be one of my biggest recommendations. I also feel like take a risk. Don't play it safe. I feel like this is a time to swing big, in the sense that there are so many kids who write boring stories that do not stand out. And when I think about the essays, like, I'd rather see someone almost fail spectacularly. I'd love to see you swing big, and do something that really does justice to who you are as an applicant.
That's it for today. To our listeners, thank you for listening. You can find out more about the Charlotte Ledger at thecharlotteledger.com. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast was produced by Lindsay Banks. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast was presented by Child Care Search, providing families with personalized guidance and free referrals for quality child care programs.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.